Well, good evening, everybody. I hope you are doing well. I know it's Monday, it's not Sunday, so I am late in getting Bible study posted, Sunday school posted. Yesterday was crazy. We had our service that we were filming, and then we also did a few open airs. And then when I got home, for those who don't know, Emerson's been sick with an ear infection, so it's been an interesting, fun time for us at our house. But I wanted to continue in our series. We're in the book of Nehemiah. We had started this series in the book of Ezra, and we started last week in Nehemiah, talking about Nehemiah's calling from God and the burden he placed on Nehemiah's heart when he was the cupbearer of the king of Persia, and how he gave him that vision. And it was really a lesson on biblical leadership and vision, and following through on that. So it was a good study. So if you did not get a chance to watch it, go on YouTube and look it up, or go back to last week on Facebook to see the video. So we saw last week how God can and does work through those with a passion and a prayer and working for the kingdom of God. This week, we'll see how God always equips believers even in the face, or especially in the face of opposition. We're going to be looking at Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 1 through 9, and we'll go over Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 1 through 5, and I'll put all this in the comments, and then Nehemiah 6, verses 14 through 16. Before we do, I want to ask y'all a couple questions to think about, and the good news is, because of COVID-19, some of these you actually may have answers for. What could you endure 52 days without? No sugar? No coffee for 52 days? No television for 52 days? I think we can probably cross that one off because of COVID-19. No internet. I can tell in our household we definitely can't go without that with two little boys who watch YouTube Kids and Netflix and Disney Plus all the time. No running water for 52 days. Whew. Even worse. No food. Well, physically, I think that's actually physically impossible to do. No drinking water. Again, not physically possible to do for 52 days. Now, while 52 days without sugar is doable, and 52 days without food would be very difficult, and without water would be deadly, again, those are impossible. Why are we bringing 52 days up? Well, in a mere 52 days, the total destruction of the walls around Jerusalem and its gates had been rebuilt. So Nehemiah and the crew, we talked about last week about his leadership and how he scouted around the area at night. And in 52 days, they were able to rebuild the wall and the gates. And the 52 days when that was happening, there obviously was opposition from the people that were around that did not want to see Jerusalem strong again. There were threats, there were danger, and we're going to see how God provides for Nehemiah and for his followers in the midst of this opposition. So let's go to Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1 through 9 says this. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones. Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half of its height, for the people worked with all their heart. This also goes to talk about motives right there, and passion for the workers. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, and the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come up and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. All right, so Nehemiah's first challenge came from the outside of the Jewish community. Those who do not understand God's work often throw up the biggest barriers to it at first. Um, for Nehemiah, opposition came from Sanballat and Tobiah, and these are two men who stood to suffer economic impact and political loss if Jerusalem became a power center again. They both served as magistrates or local governors or rulers in the provinces under Judah, Samaria, and Ammon. If Jerusalem became secure with new walls, it could emerge once again as a financial center in the area and diminish their center's value. So, when the word of Nehemiah's plans became known, Sanballat and Tobiah tried to discourage the project. They tried to prevent it. They began by insulting the Jews, implying that they lacked intelligence and the skill to build a wall. When this failed, they formed a coalition with other neighboring entities and plotted together, according to verse 8, to fight against Jerusalem. When Sanballat to the north, Arabs to the south, Ammonites to the east, and says, and people of Ashdod, which by the way, that would be the descendants of the Philistines, to the west, Judah was literally surrounded by their enemies. And so, Nehemiah's first response was prayer. You'll see that a recurring theme in his leadership, whether it be his calling and the passion to come and rebuild the wall, or his day-to-day activities, he regularly started with prayer whenever he was faced with a challenge. So what he does is he invites God to take the lead in his struggles against his foes. Then he acted. He posted a guard at the night and the day. So he went to prayer first in inquiring of the Lord, what should I do? And then second of all, God gave him some wisdom, or he had it, was that he posted a guard both day and night to guard against any attack. All right. The remainder of the chapter describes how Nehemiah equipped the workers with weapons and organized them to be ready to fight on top of rebuilding the wall. He challenged them to remain vigilant, not fear, and to remember the Lord and his faithfulness. Judah's enemies never made good on their threats, and the Jews continued building. Now, why did that happen? Well, one of the main reasons that they never made good on their threats is because Nehemiah, if we remember, was sent to go rebuild the wall by the Persian king. So even though these guys are magistrates and they're local governors, they fall underneath the Persian Empire still. And because Nehemiah had the Persian king's blessing and seal and the orders of approval, all they could do is give threats. They weren't going to dare attack because they know that would incur the wrath of the Persian king and the Persian Empire. All right. So we're going to go on to another part of this passage in Nehemiah chapter 5, another part of the story. So he's facing these attacks from without, and now we're going to see another passage in Nehemiah 5, verses 1 through 5, where Nehemiah has to overcome the enemy that was amongst him or within his own camp. So we'll go ahead and go to, and just so you remember, I already said this, but just in case, Tobiah is identified as an Ammonite official. He was the governor of Ammon under the Persians. And then Sanballat is identified as the Horonite, and that's chapter 2, verse 10 and 19. These are residents of Beth Horon in Samaria. So there's actually evidence in Egyptian text indicating he was the governor of Samaria. So those two guys are proven that they did exist. They did try to make problems against Nehemiah rebuilding the church. All right. While Sanballat and Tobiah were physical enemies and eventually enlisted other people and groups to fight against Jerusalem's rebuilding, some would say that discouragement and doubt within the Jewish camp was their biggest enemy. How is prayer a formidable force against weapons within our emotions? What I would like to say with that is, if you're in constant communication with God and you have a vigilant prayer life, then what that does is it helps reinforce trust with God, because God is speaking with you and he can calm your nerves, and he also helps give a bigger vision than just the one you're limited to seeing on your own. God helps put things in a divine perspective and helps us get a lot bigger perspective than what we originally see. So it can help calm us and approach things not from a standpoint of fear, but of reality, but at the same time of planning for the future and being vigilant and trusting in God. And a prayer life, a formidable prayer life, helps with that. How do we find the balance between trusting God and taking the necessary precautions against danger? How do we know when it is time to pray and when it is time to get off our knees and take action? Now, I will say that what we're going through right now with COVID-19 is actually a good topic to bring this to modern day life. I have this discussion with family members and with other friends, other officers, and they say, well, why aren't you panicking? Why aren't you freaking out? And I said, well, one, I've got to trust God. Otherwise, I will freak out. I've got to trust that God who says he will protect me will. That God who says he does watch over my whole family does. But then secondly, once we've been led by prayer to institute practical steps for our shelter, for ourselves, to prevent against getting coronavirus. So for ourselves personally, my wife and I don't go out anywhere. We go to Walmart, we go to CVS for shopping. Walmart, we pick up with our car so we don't have to go in as much as possible. When we do go inside, we wear a face mask. We wear an N95 mask and another mask on top of that. We sanitize before we go in, sanitize after we come out. And then, we don't go anywhere, where we can get it from somebody else. When we're at work, we do several things with work. We have instituted policies where people can't just come in. They have to talk to us through the glass doors, unless they're a resident. And even then, if they're a resident, they have to have temperature checks and make sure that they're healthy, whatever. So we did a lot of policies and procedures to help safeguard our employees as well as our residents of our shelter. We also provided N95 masks to all of our staff. We provided medical masks, surgical masks to all of our residents as well as all of our staff. And most of our business is done through phone and through internet as much as possible. All of our staff meetings are done through Microsoft Teams or Zoom. Our worship services are filmed and done through Facebook Live or through whatever, Facebook Premiere. My wife's the genius with all that stuff, not me. Be grateful for her. Corpus Christi, Salvation Army, or else nothing would get done the way it is right now. But we had done practical steps. So here's the thing. When you're doing everything that the doctors, the scientists tell you to do on top of trusting God, that's when you have to leave it in the hands of God. I'm taking vitamin C. My wife's taking vitamin C. Our boys are taking vitamin C. But we're doing everything that the scientists and the doctors, the experts are saying, and we're Christians, so we trust God. So at that point, there's no point in trying to be paralyzed by fear anymore. You still have to go on living life, but doing so in a different way than we prefer until there's a vaccine, until there's a cure. So that's the balance. I think that's where I find the balance for us as a family, for us as the Salvation Army, is still doing your ministry, still reaching out to people, still meeting human needs, but finding different ways to do this. So this has definitely stretched us. But also at the end of the day, you have to trust God that if he called you to this mission, if he called you to your ministry, that he's also going to watch over you and protect you. Okay, now you don't want to go do something stupid. So obviously if I were to say, hey, we're going to send you into a place where everybody's coronavirus positive, well, that's would be dumb for me, to not prepare. Now, another thing I do is when I come back from the office is I take my shoes off outside, either leave them out there, I put them somewhere where the boys can't reach them. I go and change clothes, and if I can, I take a shower so that I'm clean, sanitized, so I don't have to worry about my children or my wife getting it from me. So those are all practical steps. But I can tell you, every night I pray before I lay my head down to finally fall asleep that the Lord would continue to grant protection over all of us, over this household, over the core members, over our employees, our volunteers, our residents, because number one, they're part of our extended family. They are a part of who we care for, or a part of our congregation. And so I've got to trust God. And I can tell you, God has been up to that test. We have not had anybody get the virus yet. We had a scare at our own house for a couple of days, but so far that we confirm, nobody has had it yet. All right. So that's just a little information for COVID-19 and trusting God while also providing practical steps. All right. In addition to King Artaxerxes allowing Nehemiah to go to Jerusalem, giving him letters of authority, and providing construction materials, the king appointed Nehemiah as governor of Judah. This gave Nehemiah the official authority to commission and direct workers to mediate the usury conflict between Jews in chapter 6. So, basically, Sanballat and the other guy, they can't attack because They may be the governors, regional governors of Samaria and the other place, but it's Ammon, or he's an Ammonite, Tobiah is, but Nehemiah has legal authority from the Persian king that he is the governor of Judah, that is his area. So what he does in his area, as long as the Persian king is okay with it, it doesn't matter what the others say around him. So it's only vain threats. All right, let's go on to Nehemiah 5, verses 1 through 5. It says this, "Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against the fellow Jews. Some were saying, 'We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain.' Others were saying, 'We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during this famine.' Still others were saying, 'We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are on the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." Now, there's a couple of things I wanted to note here that's interesting. In verse 3, some of the poorer people, the Jews, were saying that they had to mortgage their vineyards and homes to get grain during this famine, which is important because remember there was a famine back when Joseph was sent to Egypt. And so the famine is what led to their capture and being in Egypt for 400 years. Now, that's just some context and understanding. But here, the poorer Jews are suffering because they're having to sell their children, which I can't even fathom what that's like, into slavery because their fields are owned by other Jews or the Persians. So, while Nehemiah dealt with the external conflict with Sanballat and Tobiah the Ammonite, he's also got internal enemies or internal conflict in situations. The wealthy people took advantage of those who struggled to make ends meet. Doesn't sound at all familiar with anything nowadays, right? Lean crops that year, coupled with the demands of the building project, placed their financial hardship on so many of the people. Some had borrowed money to pay for food as well as the annual imperial tax imposed by the Persians. So they still had to pay taxes. So taxes have existed for a long time. They will continue to exist until Jesus comes back. And who knows, maybe even then they'll still exist. I don't know. So anyways, a number of them had to mortgage their land and had to offer their children as slaves to help pay their debts. So in response, Nehemiah calls a public meeting. First, he compliments them for rescuing fellow Jews who were sold to Gentiles to pay debts. That's in verse 8 of the passage. Now, we're going to go to Leviticus chapter 25. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 47 to 53. And I'm going to read from the NASB. Now, this is an instruction that God gave his people before they went into the promised land. So remember, Leviticus is a book of a holiness code. It's rules and regulation for them to be a distinct or a separate people when they go to march into the land. So what Nehemiah does is he reminds his people internally about this passage from Leviticus chapter 25, verse 47 through 53. And the subtopic of the section is titled, "Of Redeeming a Poor Man." And I'm reading from the NASB. It says, "Now if the means of a stranger or a sojourner with you becomes sufficient, and a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to him as to sell himself to a stranger who is sojourning with you, or to a descendant of a stranger's family, then he shall have redemption right after he has been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son may redeem him, or one of his blood relatives from his family may redeem him. Or, if he prospers, he may redeem himself. He then, with his purchaser, shall calculate from the year when he sold himself to him up to the year of Jubilee, and the price of his sale shall correspond to the number of years. It is like the days of a hired man that he shall be with him. If there are still many years, he shall refund part of his purchase price in proportion to them for his own redemption. And if few years remain until the year of Jubilee, he shall so calculate with him. In proportion to his years, he is to refund the amount for his redemption. Like a man hired year by year, he shall be with him. He shall not rule over him with severity in his sight." Okay, so this is a portion in Leviticus where God has laid a portion about redeeming someone who falls into slavery, a poor person, and there was a way to get out of it, basically. So Nehemiah knows this. God had commanded his people to do this wherever possible. Nehemiah confronts the people with this problem. They had enslaved their own people by taking interest in their children. Such practice not only took advantage of the disadvantaged, it also tarnished God's name. God had commanded his people to be generous with each other and not to charge interest. Now, for that part, we're going to go to Deuteronomy 23. So let me go to it real quick. And again, I'll put this all in the descriptions so you can all look it up. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 19 through 20. It says this: "You shall not charge interest to your countrymen, interest on money, food, or anything that has been loaned an interest. You may charge interest to a foreigner, but to your countrymen you shall not charge interest, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land which you are about to enter to possess. When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for it would be sin in you, and the Lord your God will surely require it of you. However, if you refrain from vowing it, it would not be sin to you. You shall be careful to perform what goes out from your lips, just as you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised." All right, so in that passage there was a portion where they're not supposed to charge interest to each other as countrymen. They can charge interest to a foreigner living amongst them, or foreigners renting land, whatever. They were a community of believers who must be different from the rest of society. Even though charging interest has widely been accepted since probably about the beginning of time, they are not to charge each other interest if they're countrymen, if they're fellow Jews. So Nehemiah asked in verse 9, "Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies?" The Jewish leaders responded positively to Nehemiah's rebuke. They adopted the loss from the loans, and they returned the fields to the families. Generosity and grace once again characterized the community of faith as it always should have characterized. I was thinking of having this conversation with myself the other way on the way home. What is required by law isn't the same thing for Christians. So that's the bare minimum we should do. As Christians, what's required by law to take care of somebody else also includes what is morally and ethically responsible of us to do for somebody. For example, while we may not be required to allow people to work from home if they are able, it would make sense if they're able to do their work, and the Army's mission can keep going on because they're doing their task and they're kept accountable, whatever, that the Christian attitude would be like, okay, it's not required by law, however, it makes sense, and we're caring for the families of those people, maybe we should do that. That discussion's coming to a boardroom probably near you one day. Okay, so Nehemiah 6. We're going to go over to Nehemiah 6 now, verses 14 through 16. Nehemiah 6 relates the final challenges to completing the wall. And so we'll read verses 14 and 16 of the passage. "Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophet Noadiah and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in the 52 days. 52 days. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen a picture of Jerusalem or have even been to Jerusalem. It is a big city. And getting that wall done in 52 days, that's a miracle. I mean, we're building a building right now, and it's taking basically a whole year to build this building. Now, granted, it's more than just a wall. But to build a wall the size of Jerusalem with the gates and refurbish those in 52 days is a miracle. All right. Excuse me. Yeah, drink too. Okay. So here, there's a miracle that's happened. They've rebuilt in the 52 days. The final attack during the rebuilding of the walls and the gates was a personal one upon Nehemiah himself. within every Christian leader or every leader in the Bible, there's always some personal attack that comes at them, whether it be Moses, whether it be Joseph, whether it be, Jesus, whether it be, Paul, whether, whoever you name. There's always a personal attack that comes upon a person as well. So the false accusation that Sanballat makes against Nehemiah is in verse 9. So in verse 9, if we go to that, and I'm going to flip to it real quick because I have to go back because I'm using my iPad. Okay, Nehemiah. I had left it there in Deuteronomy, but now I got to go back. Nehemiah. Chapter 6. Okay. All right. And starting at verse 9, it says, "For all of them were trying to frighten us, thinking, they will become discouraged with the work and it will be undone. But, oh, God, strengthen my hands." Okay. So, they were trying to attack him. They were trying to give false accusations against Nehemiah. If you go back, and I'll read verse 6, it says, "It was written, it is reported among the nations that Gashmu says that you and the Jews are planning to rebel, therefore you are rebuilding the wall, and you are to be their king according to the reports." So basically what they were doing is they were trying to level a charge that Nehemiah was trying to rebuild the kingdom of Judah and set himself up as the king of Judah, which is not true at all. Remember, he had made the promise to Artaxerxes, the current king of Persia, that he would come back. The king and his wife made him promise before they allowed him to come back. So they had leveled this false charge against him that he was trying to establish a kingdom again and set himself up as the king. And what he does is he prayed for God to strengthen his hands in the midst of this. How and why does the spiritual enemy attack the leader in any worthy endeavor? Well, I think it can look differently. One thing is discouragement is always a big one. But some of the attacks are also very personal. As we said, everyone has endured personal attacks who's been a leader in the Bible or in the New Testament church. Because sometimes Satan knows that, first of all, spiritual warfare is real, and he may not be able to get through to a leader because the leader is very smart and God is honoring his plans and everything. So what Satan will try to do is he'll try to get to you personally through a personal weakness, or you're playing on your emotions or your heart, which we are all susceptible to leaning on. And so he knows that, and so he tries to get on Nehemiah the same way. All right. How much more does this emphasize the need for godly leaders? What leaders are you lifting in prayer for wisdom and protection? I think we need godly leaders who are daily seeking the Lord, because knowing that there are going to be attacks that come from without, from within the church, and by Satan on our emotions, and through personal attacks. And the old saying is leadership is lonely at the top, and which is very true. Not everyone can be a leader in the church or be a leader of anything, because leadership requires some discussions that you can't have with anybody else, where you have to make the decisions, and the only person you can go to, which is the best, is God, and you have to listen for his wisdom to be given to you. All right? So we need to make sure we have godly leaders that are honestly seeking the Lord and are trying to follow him, because otherwise it's easy to fall as a leader, to fall under the weight of all the attacks and the tribulation, you name it. Why does God need leaders in the church? Well, God can do anything he wants to do, but God chooses to give us purpose in life by giving us work to do, by giving us things to do in life. There's actually a book by, Dr. Timothy Keller up in New York. I've got several of his books, but he does one. I think it's The Work We Have to Do is the name of his book. I read it, a few months back, and it talks about the purpose of work in humanity and how it's part of our life and it actually helps fulfill our lives. But as part of why we need leaders is God sometimes reveals certain things to people that are in leadership that then have the vision to tell the rest of us where we need to go, that they've heard from God and that God has blessed their vision and discernment is given to them, and other discerners check the vision with God and see that, yes, this is of him. We can't all be leaders. If we are all leaders, nothing would get done. There's got to be followers that happen, and sometimes in our life, you may be the leader, but sometimes you may be a follower. And knowing when you're supposed to be each of those takes some good discernment. Am I supposed to step up and be the leader in this situation, or does God want me to honor whoever and see that they've got the right plan, that they're the leader in this situation? Challenges to the work of God come from both inside and outside the community of faith. If you have clear directives from God about a step of faith you are to take, what sort of opposition is the most difficult to handle? So I want you to think and rate from 1 to 5, with 1 being the most difficult and 5 being the easiest. Opposition from which one of these is the hardest? 1 being the hardest, 5 not as hard. Opposition from members of other faiths or political persuasions. Opposition from non-believer family members. Is that easy, 5, or is that really hard, 1? Opposition from believer family members. 1 really hard, 5 who cares? Opposition from church family members. 1 hard, 5 not really pretty easy. And then lastly, opposition from employers or coworkers. Is that hard to deal with, or is that easy to deal with? Now, in truth, all of these are going to have different ratings depending on your personality and where you're at. What types of behavior and or attitudes pop up in our life when we are overstressed? So think about that. Nehemiah could have gotten really overstressed in this situation. He could have gotten a critical attitude. He could have worried. He could have had a short temper. He could be tired, suffering from insomnia, anxiety, depression. All those things are common when there's challenges and you're overstressed. And so we need to make sure when we are making decisions that we're making them in the right frame of mind. Last question, in what ways do you need God's presence in your life this week? When you think about the opposition that you're dealing with, whether it be external forces or internal forces in your own family or internal forces in your own organization, how is God requiring you to reach out to Him this week? How do you need His presence to help you weather the different storms? Like Nehemiah, I think a good prayer for us as we close this lesson is praying to the Lord, strengthen my hands. There are times in life as leaders where when you're trying to hold everything up and you're trying to be strong for everybody, and you're about to fall apart. Remember the story with Moses as they're holding his hands up for a battle, but he's getting tired, so he has to have people hold his hands up so that they can continue to win the war. We all need help. And part of the thing is sometimes when you're the leader, that help can come in different ways, but it can come through other people that are underneath you, delegating things. It can come from the Lord, honestly, just giving you the strength of character and heart, and Him carrying you through a situation, giving you that strength in your hands and of your heart and of your mind. And I think those you have to have before you can attempt anything great for God, or because anything you attempt that is great for God is going to endure a lot of opposition from those that are not of God, and maybe from the people of God themselves. As we've seen stories with Moses, as we've seen the stories here with Nehemiah, just because God's giving you a vision doesn't mean that everybody in God's people will agree with it. There has to be buy-in. You'll have to convince some. But if you know that God's called you to something and that He's in the project, and He's in whatever the orders He's given you, you have to pursue it. You have to fight for it and go out all for it and pray for God to give you the strength to do it. So I hope this has been a good lesson on overcoming opposition and the different forces. So please make sure you're keeping wise what you're doing, but ultimately make sure you're trusting the Lord. Because He alone is the one who's going to be able to sustain you in times of hardship. So have a word of prayer, and then we will see you back for Bible study and the different things throughout the week, and then for Sunday services. Father, we thank You for this day. We thank You for this lesson on Nehemiah. We thank You for helping us see through him again, a man who was dependent upon his prayer life with You and communicating with You. And that, Lord, he went through many times where leadership was lonely for him. Lord, he went where there was problems that faced him on the outside from outside forces. There were problems that faced him from the inside from God's own people. And then there were personal attacks that came against him. And against all those things, Lord, he had to have a steady hand and a steady heart. And the only way he was able to do that was because you strengthened him. So, Lord, I pray for everybody who's watching this tonight, today, whenever they see this, that, Lord, you would strengthen their heart, strengthen their mind, and strengthen their hands to do what you have called them to do. And to have an assurance and confidence and boldness that they're doing what you've called them. So I pray you give them peace and an assurance that they're walking in what they're supposed to be. And Lord, if we're not, we pray that you redirect us, that we humbly receive correction, and we come back and follow your directions so we can build your kingdom. Lord, whether it be building a wall or building a church or finding new ways to do ministry, building a shelter, building whatever, Lord, we just pray that you would give us a clear vision and guidance on how to do this so that you are glorified in it. Thank you for Nehemiah and his example and how he trusted in you in his prayer life and how he was reassured and uplifted and emboldened from your relationship with him. Now, Lord, help us to be the same. May we be strengthened in our hearts, our minds, and our hands for this week. Amen. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you later.